All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Novel and welcome to the latest installment of Novel at Home, I should say, where we bring authors to you, to your living room, to your home office, or wherever you're leisure zooming these days. My name is Kat Leach, and I'm the Social Media and Promotions Coordinator here at Novel. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we welcome Professor Elizabeth Jemison and Reverend Laura Gettys to discuss Jemison's new book, Christian Citizens, Reading the Bible in Black and White in the Post-Emancipation South. After their discussion, they'll use the Q&A function to answer audience questions. You can find the Q&A button when you hover over the bottom of your screen. Feel free to enter questions at any time during the event, and they'll answer as many of them live as there is time to do so. Christian Citizens can be purchased from Novel in-store, by phone, or at novelmemphis.com. I'll be putting the link to purchase it in the chat during the program. We want to make it easy for you to shop however you're most comfortable during this strange holiday season. So Novel offers delivery, mailing, and curbside pickup. We appreciate your keeping Novel and other small local businesses in mind for your holiday shopping needs this year. And now to introduce our guests. Our featured author tonight is Elizabeth Jemison, an assistant professor of religion at Clemson University, as well as a Memphis native and graduate of St. Mary's Episcopal School. She is joined in conversation by Reverend Laura Gettys, clergy at Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Reverend Gettys is past board president and current board member of the Lynching Sites of Memphis project. Let's give them both a warm virtual welcome.
What do virtual welcomes look like? This kind of thing? I'm not sure.
I don't know. We can't see anyone anyway.
Thanks, Kat. So it's good to finally be together in this good way. Elizabeth and I have been talking about this time, and we're so glad that everybody has gathered. And do let folks know that it will be recorded so that if you know friends and family who can't be with us in this moment, it's available later. Isn't that right, Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's what Kat's told me, that it should be posted to the Novel YouTube channel later this week.
Great, great, great. Well, let's jump right in. You've got a book, Elizabeth, and it's been in the works for a long time. It spans a powerful amount of history from 1863 to 1900, from the Emancipation Proclamation to the 1900s, and it is a time of deep racial violence, but also, as you show us, some real hopeful moments and mile markers too. And you're real specific in the area and the geography with Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi. And I'm sharing some of this because I'm going to guess that not everybody has read the book yet, but needs to. And this would be a powerful gift for the holidays, to be sure. But some folks know you, Elizabeth, but I think it might be helpful for those that don't. You're from Memphis, as we've heard, and we have some connections in some beautiful ways. But I wonder if you would share just briefly a little bit about your childhood and background and some of that context that has brought you to this point in writing your book.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And thanks for the chance to talk about this. I mean, I think so often when I talk about academic work or books, it's in this sort of disembodied historical sense. And what made me excited about getting to talk with you and people at Novel, even at Novel being relative at this point, is that, I think there's different stories I can tell about this book. And so I grew up in Memphis. All of my family's still there. A lot of them are watching on Zoom right now. And so, for generations, my family's been in Memphis. Like you did, I went to St. Mary's, and I grew up sort of in Midtown and then close to Novel sections of town. And, I think part of how this book came to be is in some ways the questions that a bright and privileged white girl might come to ask about the role of religion and politics and race. And so that's sort of some of my background. I grew up in an evangelical church just down Poplar Avenue from Novel. And I think that was another place where I was definitely formed and where I learned to ask a lot of questions. Many of them welcomed and some of them not as welcomed in that space, but definitely always welcomed my family. And so The book is dedicated to my grandmother, who's 95 and probably watching right now, and to my parents for the ways that they really encouraged me to ask questions, encouraged me to think deeply. And certainly, you know, in the case of my parents, read every paper I ever wrote from, you know, when I learned to write until now, including the book. So that's a little bit about me.
Thanks for that. So tell us a little bit about the journey of your research. It started with the beginning of your dissertation, if I recall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've sort of been working on this project for about 9 years. And it sort of initially started as a dissertation, which basically became the first draft of the book. And, you know, I was sort of drawn to the question of kind of what happened to pro-slavery theological ideas after the Civil War. And how did religious groups begin to talk about these really important questions? Since I knew that the time after the emancipation and after the Civil War was a time of the tremendous growth of African-American churches, I wondered sort of what were they saying about these questions? And I kind of had a hunch that although at the time a lot of historians would suggest that these pro-slavery ideas that were sort of the bedrock of white Southern Protestantism had just sort of vanished, I didn't really buy that. And so I kind of spent a lot of time particularly the dissertation stage of wandering to various Southern archives, you know, big universities, but also smaller colleges, churches, denominational headquarters, some in Memphis, some throughout the sort of out the region. I would brush off my yes ma'ams and no sirs and decide whether I should wear a pearl necklace or a cross necklace into a particular space, and you know, kind of begin to ask questions about what can I find, what's available in these archives, how can I ask different questions of them than what's been there before. And so over the last few years, I've revised what started as a dissertation into a book, hopefully making it more readable and less focused on, you know, my dissertation committee's views on it. And I've had the help of tremendous friends and peers and family members too, in sort of reading and revising the project.
So you bring together strongly the idea of the Constitution and American law and scripture and religion, and you put those together with the title, Christian Citizens. Let's talk about a little bit, if you will, the idea of those together, and particularly with religion and Christianity and that use of scripture and its narrative for Black readers and white readers, particularly these Southern readers that we're talking about in this area.
Yeah, so the book is titled Christian Citizens because I find that both white Southerners and African-American Southerners had very strong ideas of being Christian citizens in their era. But those views that they had were polar opposites of each other's in terms of what that actually meant. And, you know, as historical categories, what it meant to be Christian and even what it meant to be a citizen of the United States was very much in flux at this time. So to take the category of citizen, after the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857, that declared that no person of African descent could possibly ever be a citizen, free or enslaved, of the United States. And then the 14th Amendment reversed that. That's where we got the idea of birthright citizenship, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen. And that was really a direct desire to sort of counteract the Dred Scott decision. But what being a citizen actually meant, what rights came with being a citizen, was really unclear. Women were citizens, but they couldn't vote. So clearly voting was not a right that came with citizenship. Many of the sort of individual civil and political rights were determined by local states. And so which rights African Americans in particular could claim as citizens was very much in flux through the years that I'm talking about, sort of from the sort of middle of the Civil War through the period of Reconstruction, the sort of destruction of Reconstruction by white supremacist violence, and then ultimately into, by the 1890s, the creation of legal white supremacy. And that's part of why I focus on this region, it's not just that I'm a native Memphian, but that the region, the sort of Mississippi River Valley area, tends to be the place where the political pendulum shifts widest and fastest and most violently. I now live in South Carolina, which is sort of the second in that category. But Mississippi, Louisiana, those places tend to be, as you've noticed with your work on the Memphis lynching sites, that the Memphis Massacre in 1866 and other events really shaped the nation. And so zeroing in on our region helped me see that. And so this category of citizenship was unclear, but so too was the category of what it meant to be a Christian. As I noticed in the note in the book, most people I'm writing about who talked about themselves as Christians meant that as a category of Protestant Christian. They didn't really consider Roman Catholics within that category. But for them, whether being a Christian meant, as it did for many African Americans, fighting against racism and racial hierarchy as sin and as unconstitutional, that was their view. Most white Southerners saw themselves as Christian as trying to maintain the status quo, maintain racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, and other forms of what they would consider proper order of society. And so for them, that was their Christian duty. And so the very contrasting ideas of this, I think, is really what's important in terms of kind of drawing me to this, both the title and this idea of looking at how very differently people were viewing the ideas of Christian citizenship.
Right. And as a priest myself, I am mindful of both the good and the really, really bad that the church can do. And so I think, particularly in the South, being in the Bible Belt and naming, the place that so often the Christian faith has and how it is imbued in so much, it certainly comes out. And you name that as central for how the differences in the readings could be, but were taken in such strong ways and differing ways, like you said. So I'm mindful of, I forget which chapter it is in the book, but talking about that there was a prayer for wisdom by one of the churches on how to deny voting rights to Blacks, because that somehow was a part of the Christian faith and how this idea of what was needed to be done by those white Christian Southerners. More to share on that, or anything more to add?
Yeah, I think that's part of what I was interested in looking at in this period, is not just what was happening inside church spaces. And there are sermons where white ministers are supporting violent white supremacist elections. They are denouncing African-American civil and political rights. You have the same thing from or the opposite from Black churches, where Black churches are saying racism is a sin and it's our job as ministers to root out these false ideas. But so rarely would white Christians actually listen to those Black ministers as they were preaching. But what I also showed was that, as you mentioned, when the state of Mississippi convened a state constitutional convention in 1890 for the known purpose of finding a way to deny Black men the right to vote. They knew they couldn't do it on the basis of race, but they came up with innovative ideas of poll taxes and literacy tests. They had a very distinguished Methodist bishop, Bishop Galloway, opened the whole event in prayer, praying for God's wisdom on what would come. And then every morning, different ministers, white ministers, would come and open prayer for the meeting. And then when they came up with, they basically settled on what they thought were the best ideas. They stopped the whole proceedings for a day of prayer in local churches and sent their delegates out to local white churches in Jackson, Mississippi, to pray for God's blessing on this new plan that would basically institute legal disenfranchisement of Black voters that would last until the Voting Rights Act. And so you see the ways that religious language is not just something that's happening in churches. It's in state conventions. It's in African Americans' colored conventions that were held often in these years. There's not a strict boundary between church and state type issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about talking about taking the Bible seriously? And I use that quotation. It's one that you and I have talked a little bit about. And some of the serious impact that phrase has had. You talk a bit about abandoning biblical truth for, I think it was trendy ideas of human equality and such. So take us there a little bit more and go a little bit more deeper on how scripture has been a part in that way.
Yeah, so I think particularly as I think you're talking about ways that white Southern Christians talked about these sort of new ideas about equal civil and political rights, for instance. To understand that, you really need to back up just a little bit to the way that the Bible was used to defend slavery. Pro-slavery theology was the founding idea of Southern Protestantism in these years, white Protestants, obviously. It's why you ended up with the Southern Baptist Convention and separate Southern denominations like the Southern Methodist denomination, Southern Presbyterians, that would last well into the 20th century. Obviously, Southern Baptist Convention still exists today. And those groups said they needed to be separate because only they understood that the Bible, rightly understood, supported slavery. And they argued that by saying, God is a God of order. God wants the world to be orderly. And 4 places in the New Testament, it says for slaves to obey their master. And never does Jesus say slavery is a sin. Therefore, we have the higher biblical ground. And those Northerner and anti-slavery Christians are just throwing out the Bible in favor of new ideas of human equality, of inalienable rights. These ideas come from the Enlightenment. They come from, political documents. They don't come from the Bible. And what I show is the ways that what's so powerful about these ideas is that they're able to persist in the sort of logic of pro-slavery theology after slavery ends. And so white Southerners continue to argue, first, that they were explicitly, they'll say, we were right on the question of slavery. It is supported by the Bible. Sort of that we recognize that ship has sailed, but they would say that again in the late 1860s. They say it again in the 1870s. They're very explicit in saying we still endorse these views. But with that, they would say we endorse these views because we need to hold fast to what the Bible says, rather than all these newfangled ideas about human equality, rather than all these new ideas about racial equality. And they weren't listening to the Black Christians who were very clearly saying, and had been saying since David Walker, an abolitionist who wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829. So Black Christians have been saying this for decades, that racial hierarchy is sinful. They would use a story from Acts chapter 10, where Peter has a vision of of unclean animals, and saying that the way it's interpreted is that Peter learns he should not distinguish between Gentile and Jewish Christians, and therefore he should go to this Gentile centurion's house, Cornelius, and welcome him into this Christian community, even though he's not Jewish. And David Walker used that story years before the Civil War to say all racial hierarchy is sinful. But white Christians didn't believe that. They didn't even listen to that idea. For them, holding fast to the Bible meant defending the proper idea of the Christian household. So it wasn't just defending slavery, it was linking slavery as being okay because it was like marriage. Now, slavery was not like even the very hierarchical version of marriage that was the law in the 19th century. But saying that slavery was like marriage both made slavery sound more kind of excusable, more tolerable. It was another form of household relationship, just like the power that parents have over their children, the argument went. And all of these 3 relationships, enslavement, marriage, and parenting, appear as parallels in a lot of New Testament passages, where every one of the 4 passages that say for slaves to obey their masters is a verse or 2 away from a wives obey your husbands instruction. And so for white Southerners, taking the Bible seriously, the phrase you sort of started the question with, meant defending the sort of household hierarchy that God designed, where white men are at the top, where their wives and their children and their enslaved people, as the logic went, were obliged to obey them. And that was something that was just nonsensical to African-American Christians. They didn't fit in that family world at all. They thought that that idea was just appalling. And obvious, it was both for them bad theology, a bad reading of the Bible, and unconstitutional. After the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments and all of the Reconstruction legislation that was designed to secure Black equality in America, or at least to limit racial inequality in America.
So I'm glad you're talking a bit about this patriarchal hierarchy, because that gets us into the roles and gender. And you shared about a woman that was new to me, and I'm grateful because I'm always learning. And I did not know about Charlotte Hawkins Brown in the 1920s here in Memphis, and her words, her strong words about how what she said is white women have perpetuated much around racial inequality. and that Black women lay all the responsibility on the white woman. Will you talk a little bit about that? And let's just name that you and I are two white women talking about this, and to acknowledge the history that we as white women have in particular. I'm mindful of the suffragette movement. There's much here, and we only have a certain amount of time, but I'd like to unpack
I'll try to be brief. Yeah. So I think that while talking about the way that gender hierarchy was such an important part of how white Southerners justified basically creating a white supremacist Christianity that would support segregation. What's also happening at the same time is that white women are buying in, particularly privileged white women. So to name us as both private school graduates, you and me, Laura, and privileged white women bought into that system, despite the ways that it was sort of predicated on their subordination to men around them, because it gave them so much racial and class privilege. And they were very willing to support these ideas of defending family values and defending white women, which you and I both know was a false and a horrific reason for the justification of lynching. Since the work of Ida B. Wells in 1892, we've known that that was a lie, but we, particularly white Americans, have not always listened. And so white women were particularly involved at all levels of this. And part of what I see is that even looking at individual white women, one woman in particular who lived in sort of lower Mississippi Valley in Natchez, and she was at the time of the Civil War sort of horrified at Union troops occupying Natchez. She was convinced that God was still going to create Confederate victory, even though all the signs around her were indicating otherwise. She was praying to God to support the Confederacy. She was convinced that God was on the side of the Confederacy. And she and many other women like her, lost a lot of wealth because their wealth had been based on the property and the labor, the sort of physical bodies of enslaved people. And so they lost wealth after the Civil War. But by the 1890s, even though she and her sisters and their father had to mostly sell away their land, she'd never married. She was not impoverished, but certainly not wealthy by the end of her life and her sort of mature years in the 1890s. But she was a leader of the Natchez United Daughters of the Confederacy, trying to create memorials to a time when she had felt carefree and privileged, and to sort of remember that time as something that was sort of the model of a Christian society, even though, of course, it was based on the labor and the sort of violence against enslaved people. So you see the ways that white women have been throughout this whole story, particularly privileged white women, very much on the side of supporting the white supremacist patriarchy because it benefited them in so many ways. I think we see a lot of that. And so what you're talking about with Charlotte Hawkins Brown, an African-American educator, a woman who ran schools, particularly in the state of North Carolina, but came to Memphis in the early 1900s and sort of used that as sort of a coda on the book in the conclusion. And it's something I want to look into more as I think about another book eventually. She's sort of saying, well, if you look at this crisis of lynching, it's a group of mostly white women who consider themselves the progressives of their era. They're the ones who invited a bunch of African-American women to speak to their group. And she sort of lays it out for them. So you think that you're somehow enlightened, but look at all of the ways that you white women are benefiting from this system, that you're allowing violence against African-American men and women. And you think of yourselves as innocent, but she says, I'm telling you, you're not. And I think that's a really important voice to have it sort of in the conclusion of the book.
I think that really is. And it speaks to how, yes, white Southerners lost the Civil War, but won perhaps the post-slavery battle over Southern history. Memorials, monuments, and that narrative that has been told, an incorrect myth in so many ways, and what is perpetuated. So all the more reason of why this history is so important and why it's all of our stories. It's all of our stories, particularly yours and mine and all those with white skin, but it's all of our collective story and history. And stories of the past are always about the present. They are always about the present. So I'm mindful that, of course, this feels like a long time ago in terms of the history that you are naming, but we are continuing to live so much of it out, aren't we? In the impact and the parallels They say that, history, there's no new history. We repeat it ourselves in many ways. So I'm mindful of the now. And there's so many other ways I want to go deeper, but mindful of what we can learn now, and understanding our history can help us better understand our present times. And I'm wondering now, in this time that we are in politically, religiously, around the religious right, fundamentalism, our administration and politics, thoughts, reflections on all of that and what we've begun to share tonight.
And all of that. Just a couple of, yeah.
Just a little right there.
Those are not any big topics. Well, what I would say is that I think a couple things. One of them is that, if people who are concerned about, white Christian, and it's not just evangelical, it's white Catholic, it's white mainline Protestant embrace of Donald Trump and voting for him. If they say this is an aberration, this is not who we are, I think when you actually look at our history and say that maybe we don't want to admit it, but I think it has been who white Americans broadly, and particularly white Christians, have been.
This is who we are. And there's something about acknowledging and claiming that. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe a place to start. And then I would say that thinking about then how to take Memphis and your work with the Lynching Sites Project and that of others in town who've worked on that. How do we name our landscape? How do we think about, not just removing the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest from what used to be, Forest Park, and I think is now the Medical University's park. Yes, it's important to think about, well, why was he even there in 1905? Why would you, dig up his wife's and his graves from Elmwood and move them to that park in 1905? What kind of message are you sending about sanctifying white supremacy by doing that? And then what do we need to be doing today? Same with the People's Grocery lynching site in Memphis and so many others. And I'd love you to, you know more about the sort of local side of this than I do. But it's why when we think about whatever the local political issue, whether it's about, how we all need our public schools to be places where children are able to thrive and have the resources they need. And why have they often not been in the city of Memphis and in so many other places? Well, how does that tie into these stories? And how does that tie into, which families, which neighborhoods in Memphis are subject to flooding by the Wolf River and which are not? Where do the resources go? And those are all tied into this kind of story of the ways we have invented collectively our history and the ways we've told stories about who matters and who doesn't. And I think it ties into all these kinds of stories, but certainly the work that you've done, the Lynching Sites Project, I think is such an important way of acknowledging that story.
Well, it is a collective story, and I have had the honor of being a part of it with many other wonderful people. And as Ida B. Wells has said so well, and she is certainly the clarion for the group, is the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And so the Lynching Sites Project was really officially begun in 2015. But it is a growing network of people who want the whole and accurate truth to be told about our history of Shelby County. We both grew up in Memphis, but I did not learn that Shelby County has the highest amount of known lynchings in the entire state. I wish I'd known that history. I wish I'd learned about the Memphis Massacre. Of course, it was not known as that. It was known as the Memphis Riot until it was more accurately named the Memphis Massacre, rightfully so. I wish I'd known and heard more about the Mr. Calvin McDowells and Mr. Thomas Moss and Mr. Will Stewart, whom you mentioned with the People's Grocery, because their lynchings in 1892 and Wash Henley's in 1869 and Lee Walker's in 1893 and so many others that are unnamed. This group is trying to do the research and the history so we can shine that light and that truth and heal and grow as we openly face this history of racial violence in our community. So we have markers that get placed in these places when we can locate them. There's a lot of powerful history and research that's done by many. And those are interfaith services, and they are powerful. Another big part, though, too, is the gatherings that we have, the meetings. We try to meet the second and fourth Monday of each month. And I have met so many wonderful people and have formed some really long-term friendships and have grown as I've done my own racial work and had and continue to have those scales fall from my eyes as I better learn and understand about my personal journey and privilege and what my skin has given me as I listen to others and their journeys. So these listening circles that we have are powerful. And I tell you, I walk away connected and feel more full as a human being after these gatherings. It's some of the best work that I think is being done in Memphis, but I am biased. I'll name that bias, and I'll name many others. But I would like to make sure that people know about the Lynching Sites Project, and that if they want to find out more, that they can go to the lynchingsitesmem.org. But if you Google Lynching Sites Memphis, it'll take you to that site. And we have maps and ways you can get involved and subscribe to our or I don't know if we have podcasts yet, but information and updates on when we have meetings and things like that. So I want to make sure folks know about that.
Yes, and I've not living in Memphis for basically since I was 18. I still have been able to sort of see your email list and your newsletters, and I think you're doing such important work. And I think that's a piece of what needs to happen. And I know that there are people here from faith communities, from churches who are engaged in that work. And what I think is just so important is to recognize that, particularly for us white Memphians, and I'll include myself as a Memphian there in that category, this is deep and important work, and work that we need to do in community with other people, and work where we need to listen to people who will challenge our views. I mean, so if you want to root out racism in white churches, that's great. Think about how it's been tied to gender hierarchy, to exclusion of LGBT folks, about sort of certain ideas of families that get to count and those that don't. Because I think that there's a deep history of these ideas, and I wish that they weren't. So I wish my book did not feel relevant in 2020. I wish it felt like ancient history that we've well discussed and dealt with. But unfortunately, it doesn't feel that way this year or recently. And so I think that it's not just a matter of any particular political administration, but it's a matter of everyone working on understanding this history better themselves, and trying to shape our community and listening to others. So thank you for what you and so many people at the Lynching Sites Project are doing. I think it is some really important work in Memphis.
It's good stuff. It is. I am mindful of our time, and I'm getting a bit of a signal to maybe turn our eyes to the Q&A board, or whatever we call this thing that we do virtually now. So I'm mindful of a few questions that have popped up, and just want to name and invite others if they have questions to join in the Q&A time. Let's see. So I see from Larry Lloyd that he mentions that Jim Wallace with Sojourners, a wonderful organization and group, calls racism America's original sin in one of his books. Would you care to speak to that at all and say some more?
I mean, I'd say Larry should speak to this, but I'll give it a stab. And that's that, if you back up to an earlier point in American history from what I'm really talking about, if you look at the 1600s, for instance, when a lot of the sort of slave society colonies were being founded, what you see is that the ideas of what race means were being created at the same time that these colonies were being created. I can start rattling off history books I recommend, but I'm not going to do that right now. The category of race as we understand it today didn't exist in 1500 or 1400 or years before that. Europeans tended to understand themselves very differently. They thought about Protestant and Catholic difference. They didn't think about race. One book I'll just mention is Catherine Gerbner's Christian Slavery. And one of the things that she points out in Christian slavery is that the category of white showed up in many colonies, including in the Caribbean, as enslaved people converted to Christian. So once you have enslaved people being baptized, the category they had used of Christian versus heathen just didn't fit anymore. And that's when you start seeing the word white showing up in colonial law codes. And so you see a sort of deep history of the ways that the category of race, our way of understanding what racial difference means, which is arbitrary, is socially determined, is not real. It's not real in terms of our biology, but it's very real in terms of our social and political and economic lives and experiences. Was really created at the same time that America is being created. So that's how I understand Jim Wallace's statement of slavery being America's original sin. and sort of racism being sort of, I guess racism being America's original sin, often expressed in terms of enslavement, but also in terms of genocide of Native peoples. Yes. And I think that those two came hand in hand. That's, to me, it's very prescient for the ways these sort of ideas keep getting reinterpreted over and over again.
Want to name Terry's question, a little bit of what she shares, and then thoughts. She says, white women from both the South and the North were actively engaged in the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, before the suffrage movement started. So when blame is often directed at white women for white supremacy, I have to wonder if it was white women or if it was women who supported the Confederacy, or if something changed politically to move those women away from their abolitionist actions. You have thoughts with that?
Yeah, so what I'd say is there certainly were a few Southern women engaged in that work. Most of them were, if there were women engaged, it was mostly women from the North. Some famous Southern sisters from South Carolina, where I live now, are the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, and they actually fled the South. Their views were so radical that they sort of abandoned their family ties, I say here, as in South Carolina, and went to spend most of their lives in the sort of Midwest and Northeast. So there, but it's also important to notice that at the time that these issues are being debated, abolitionist views, particularly those that weren't just anti-slavery, but were fully abolitionists, that argued that slavery should be immediately ended without any compensation to enslavers. That was an incredibly radical view. That was not the majority or even the sort of plurality of view of even people supporting the Union cause in the Civil War. It was a really radical idea. And so there were few people, there were plenty of women in that group of people who supported that view. There were Black women as well as white women involved in that work. But I think that it's a relatively small view. Now, you begin to see fractures in that movement almost immediately. So when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other white women advocates for women's equality, particularly white women's equality with white men, when they begin to support their work to defend or support white women's right to vote, you see that they're willing to sort of leave African-American women often to the side. The 19th Amendment didn't actually give Black women in America the right to vote in the same way we often think it does, because so many of African-American women were denied the right to vote through poll taxes and literacy tests and all kinds of other ideas. Now, it's absolutely the case that women on the Confederate side tended to be much more supportive of racial inequality, a sort of white supremacist hierarchy, than, say, Northern white abolitionist women would have been. And there are really important ties between the early women's rights movement and the early abolition movement. Those stories are true in the sense that there really was a close tie there. But I think that even those white women, with a few notable exceptions, are not generally the full heroes we've often been told they were. I always tell my students that history is so much messier than whatever you learned before you end up in my class. That you don't stop learning, say, math in 7th grade. You're not satisfied with your 7th grade math education. So just because you might have learned about the civil rights movement in 7th grade, and I had a fabulous 7th grade facing history curriculum when I was in 7th grade, you don't stop there. You need to understand how much more complicated this history is. Yes. And I think the same thing is true for our understanding. But Terry, I think you're right. There's a lot there. But I think it's not that white women are the heroes we've often been told they were.
All right, Rick brings up a good question. He says that he went to a church in New Jersey, and he's wondering to what extent can these issues apply to the North? So in other words,
they do
apply to the South, and yes, they do, Rick. Yes, they do.
Rick is my father-in-law. At least I assume that's the same, unless there's another Rick from New Jersey on here, and would be interesting.
Southern history matters, doesn't it? It matters.
The history matters, and you see it actually in the early fundamentalist movement. To pick New Jersey as an example, a New Jersey seminary professor, J. Grisham Machen, left Princeton Seminary, deciding it was too liberal, and went to found Westminster Theological Seminary to be properly fundamentalist and orthodox. And when he did that, he's someone who was deeply shaped by this kind of Southern white supremacist Christianity, because he'd grown up in a Southern Presbyterian church in Maryland. And his Georgia-born mother had been very active in the United Daughters of the Confederacy there. And she and he remained close. He remained close to his mother, throughout his adult life as he's sort of becoming this fundamentalist warrior, and warrior in a sort of theological, fighting with other seminary professors sense, not an actually martial action. But you see the ways that so much of both Christian white supremacy and other forms of white supremacy existed North and South. The South is not the only place with racism or with segregation or with racial inequality. You see that even in terms of how churches were being shaped.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to keep us going because these are some questions that we got going here. Megan Keel. I want to give a shout out to Megan Keel and Micah, another wonderful group doing amazing community work. She rightfully and wonderfully names the current disenfranchisement of so many Black males through those with a felony conviction as a way that white supremacy still keeps that specific population away from the vote. She's asking, do you think that white Christian citizens in Tennessee in 2020 are ready to supply the restoration of voting rights of the formerly incarcerated once they've served their sentence? And she raises the possibility since these voters might also vote against white interests, in quotation marks. That's it.
I mean, Laura, you might have thoughts on what white voters in Tennessee are ready to do. What I would say is that the idea of trying to restrict the right to vote to deserving people and framing sort of civil and political rights, not actually as rights that we should all embrace and share as sort of what it means to be members of the same civic society, that has a long history. And so you see the ways that as white Southerners in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s were first using just mob violence and intimidation to keep Black men from voting, and then later coming up with sort of more nuanced tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests. There's always this argument about, well, you want to have people vote who deserve to vote, who understand what it means, who are responsible citizens. That sort of deserving voter idea, I think, is sort of behind a lot of these, this sort of disenfranchisement of returning citizens and people who are, there's some states where you can vote while you're in prison and you can be, sent a mail-in ballot. And the states that have the most restrictive laws tend to be those with ties to sort of the Confederacy, with ties to sort of strong white supremacist histories and presence. So I don't know what Tennessee voters are ready to do, but I think if you're going to fight against it, you want to have, just deserving people should vote. First, when you think about our criminal justice system, who ends up as a felon, who gets felon, sort of that label. And why are we calling people felons? Why are we not calling them returning citizens? Why are we not welcoming them back into our communities? A lot of those ideas tie back to these 19th century ideas of who deserves equality, who deserves these rights. And I think that deserving piece is a place where we see a lot of dangerous ideas come to be.
There's a lot of privilege and past power and current power as well with that language and thinking as well. So it's a great question, Megan. It's a great question. Wondering about the response to your book that you may have received from both the African-American community and the white communities to date so far. That's a question that
so officially the book has been out for a week. And I don't have a whole lot of data to share there, but I think one thing that's been important for me is just seeing how just teaching these ideas to college students has been something I've been teaching, even if I didn't say to students, this is what I'm working on when I'm not responding to your emails, although it generally is that in a toddler. But I think sort of seeing the ways that and even just engaging with people in archives, trying to say to someone as I'm trying to ask them, could you please hand over your materials, start to tell them what kind of work I'm doing and ways I'm trying to sort of bring their histories, hopefully, to a broader audience and a broader light than they've seen in the past. I think it's been an important way to sort of see how people engage with this work. And I think one thing I've noticed just on the archive side is how important I think it is for us to go to places and talk to people. The CMU Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, has its headquarters in South Memphis, and they were so kind to me. And it helps that I was from Memphis and could pop in a number of different times. But they let me go in, and they'd had an archivist, and he'd passed away, and they had sort of in all the things that they needed to handle, didn't have a new archivist. but were eventually willing to sort of let me in to sort of show me their kind of precious materials. And I think it was such a sign of trust and of a desire to share their history. And I really appreciated that. One of the things is that denomination shows up more in my book than it tends to in similar works in this period. I think looking at the range of Black religious responses is really important. There is no such thing as the Black church as a unified monolith. That's not the case today. It wasn't the case in the civil rights movement, and it wasn't the case in the late 1800s either. And so sort of showing that range, something I was able to do because they were willing to trust me with their materials. And I think for the students I teach, it comes in, we play a little football over here. And beyond that, I tend to have a lot of white evangelical students, although I saw a question from Christopher Gerardo, a Lutheran, soon-to-be Lutheran pastor, who was one of my former students. They're not all evangelical, but I think we have the largest fellowship of Christian athletes in the country on our campus. Thousands and thousands of students participate. And so for so many students, just to understand that Christianity in America has a history, I think is really important. And that history is not simple or neat or nice, is a really eye-opening moment for a lot of students who take my classes. We talk about not just Christian groups and not just Protestants, as my book does, but the range of American religious groups. But I think for students who identify as white Christians, who assume that there's been sort of some continuous thread of good works from the time of Jesus to now, or the time of Martin Luther to now, they're really shocked, and not by me, but by the material we look at together. And so I think that this history is really important, but it's also something that people often don't even know they don't know.
Mm-hmm. I'm struck by what you shared around the sense of community, that community seems to be a part of this journey for you. And we talked about, or I mentioned around the Lynching Sites project, how it is so deeply involved with community. And I think that is so key to the journey that we're all on. This is not a solo journey. There is deeply personal, individual work to be done, but we do this work together as a community. So I'm struck by that, especially as you shared some about the churches and the African-American churches that were opening their archives to you, and you sharing about your students and connection there. Yeah, I'm struck by community and the importance of that. So in that light, would you share a little bit about what this journey has meant to you personally, if you'd be willing? That's a question that Marty Tippins Murphy was wanting to hear about.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And, I think that's something that's so often completely pushed to the side when I try to think about, well, what historiographic arguments am I trying to make in the book? And how am I engaging with X book I read in grad school that I sort of like, but also have issues with? I think this story has been sort of one that I've learned over the course of writing the book. I mentioned I started it in early 2012. So it's been almost 9 years of really engaging with this material. And I guess one thing that's I've seen for me is that I can still be shocked by the things that are actually in my book. As I've been unfolding different stories. I mean, I think of one particular story, it's in chapter 3, of the ways that the Clinton massacre, this horrific act of violence, sort of white men mass murdering African-American voters as a way of intimidating them from voting in 1875 and 1875 elections in Mississippi. I had known about that, it'd been included in the book, but it wasn't until the sort of, I guess, 2019 round of revisions, which was when I sort of rewrote a lot, particularly that section, I was re-diving into my materials, and I found this Southern Methodist newspaper where you read an entirely different version of that story. One where white people were somehow the victims, where white people were saying we were faultless, we were just defending our families, we haven't even done any violence yet, but might need to. And it was just so obviously not what the actual historical material had said, that for me, it was just sort of another, like, it shocked me and it horrified me. And I'd been working with the material for 7 years. And I think, so the journey for me is, it's ongoing. It's not solved. It's not neat or resolved. I mean, I finished a book, but I want to write more. I want to think more about where I might take these ideas and this material. And I also want to be deeply conscious of, as Laura and I've talked about both before this evening and tonight, but the position from which I approach Southern history. You know, I have a small bulletin board in my home office. It's off screen over to the side, where I have some old family newspaper clippings and a picture of me from when I was probably a little younger than 2 that I found when my grandfather passed away when I was in college. And among these sort of mementos, they're all sort of ways of reminding me of the white privilege, the sort of white racial privilege and also class privilege that surrounded my life, continues to surround my life. And I think that I don't have a solution or sort of a way where I've had a neat story of catharsis and resolution. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, but I think for me, being in conversation with both people writing on these topics from other backgrounds, and also being deeply mindful of my little bulletin board over here, of sort of ways of reminding myself of where I've come from. That I won't escape that. And the best way, I think, to do the historical work I'm trying to do the sort of teaching work I work on, you know, day in and day out doing, is to be deeply conscious of that history and willing to learn and to grow from others. I think one of the things I really see in the book is the unwillingness, particularly of white Americans across theological spectrums, and even North and South, to listen to people closest to the pain. And to listen to people who were facing violence, facing threat of violence. And I think it's so important to actually listen to the voices of those who, you know, if I think that there are certain policies that are a problem, but it's not really affecting me, I need to talk to families at our nation's border, or I need to talk or listen to their stories, and to be willing to sort of be challenged and to have new people in my life who can kind of shape my views. So I don't know if I have a neat story there, but it's certainly something it's challenging, it's ongoing. And it's part of what makes me want to keep reading and writing around these topics, because I think that there's a lot that needs to be uncovered there.
Much, yes. I so appreciate what you shared too about finding persons that you may disagree with, that and that's okay. In fact, that's really important. I call it kind of popping the bubble, and going outside our places of comfort. Brian Stevenson, who is connected to EJI and has written Just Mercy, you know, talks about getting proximate, and the importance of getting uncomfortable, and hearing other stories. And you can't hear their stories if you don't get close, if you don't lean in, if you aren't willing to become vulnerable. And I say, and in the process, hopefully be changed as well. Because when you get close, you realize there's so much that we hold together as human beings. And our history in this country, we've missed much with that. So leaning in particularly into these areas is uncomfortable at times, particularly for white people, but for all. I name the trauma for our African-American brothers and sisters. I mean, there is history here. And so to listen, to share, to hold, you know, going back to the Lynching Sites project, these markers that we put up come from some of the history that actually goes back to the Holocaust and what was done after. And for those that don't know, in many places in Europe, Germany and such, they put stoomps, or more or less, I may be mispronouncing it, but these raised stones as reminders outside the homes where Jews were taken from their homes and taken to concentration camps. And they're all over the countries there. And that is done so that they won't forget. So they'll remember the history, not to feel awful and guilty, but to acknowledge and name so it never is repeated again. And we haven't done that in this country in that way. And so these markers, these conversations, this book, all these ways in which so many in our country, and particularly in this moment, I say, we are in so many stoomps and ways in which we are trying to get proximate and close so that we don't repeat the history. And we have been given quite a house to live in, but we have the opportunity to shape that house, to renovate that house, to pull some things down that don't belong, to acknowledge the history and to keep going, because it doesn't have to remain the same, nor should it. In fact, we're all called to make it an even better and greater place too. We have just, gosh, 2 more or so minutes. We're not gonna be able to answer all these questions. Let's see, but I'm so grateful for this time. Any kind of final thoughts or words in terms of things that you want to make sure get shared that we haven't been able to touch on?
I mean, I think that what's so important is to engage with this history, particularly for folks for whom this is new. You know, Google lynching sites Memphis and find a way to join one of their gatherings. I assume you're virtual these days. You know, and I think that there's so many different ways to learn. I've seen people even in the Q&A mention some really great books. Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, something I really enjoyed this year. Maybe I'm not supposed to hawk other people's books, but Martha, buy them from Novel. Don't buy them from, you know, that place in the internet.
That questioner said that your book could be a companion piece to. That's very flattering, but I think that's a wonderful book. Another book I'd say is Martha Jones' Vanguard. As we celebrate the sort of 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment of women's right to vote, Martha Jones sort of tells the story of African-American women's struggles from before the era of emancipation to, I think Stacey Abrams is at the end of her book, to the present. And the ways that we really understand our history of voting and of political power in this country so differently if we look at it from another vantage point. So I often encourage my students to think about, well, how can we ask better questions? There may be questions that the archives can't tell us. There may be questions that are unknowable, but the kinds of questions we ask about the past determine the kinds of answers we can get. And if we're not asking questions about what people's lives were like who were not in power, what people's lives were like who were not the sort of first stories that we saw in our 8th grade or 10th grade US history textbooks, then we're not going to ever know a broader history. And so we need to learn together how to ask better questions. And I think that, you know, there are lots of ways to do that. And I think, you know, the listening circles you have at the Lynching Sites Project are an important way to do that too. But I would just encourage folks, you know, whatever the means for getting into these questions, if you're not there, dive in. And if you are there, thank you. And find ways to bring more people along with you and dive in further yourself. I know I have lots more still to learn myself, but you know, maybe I'll just say thank you so much to Laura. Thank you so much to Novel. Thanks to so many people who've joined. You know, some of you have known me since I was literally born, and some of you were my students. So many colleagues around the country. So thank you. It's really fun to get to chat both with Laura and to see so many questions. I wish we had more time to answer more of them. Me too. But I hope, though, that this time will be one that just makes people want to get your book and have a thoughtful read. And perhaps we can explore some more ways of discussion at a later date. But I've really enjoyed and valued this time together.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks to our guests for this amazing discussion. It could have gone on for 2 more hours, and I think we all would have stayed interested. Thanks to everyone for coming. It's a great turnout. And really, we just appreciate you all. And we'll see you at Novel soon, I hope, or at curbside pickup. Have a great evening.